Yeah? Hi, everyone. I'm Helen Clarkson, Chief Exec of Climate Group, and we're a global non-profit organisation with a mission to drive climate action fast. And I'm delighted to be here today to welcome all of you, those of you in the room, everyone joining us online, to introduce the opening plenary for today's event, Decoding G20's Green Development Pact, Unlocking Climate Action. So before we start, I'd like to thank our partners Sattva, Columbia University, India Climate Collaborative, and ClimateWorks Foundation, without whom today's sessions wouldn't be possible. So we're all here in Dubai at COP28 because despite this huge challenge ahead of us, we still believe. We believe in the ability of governments at all levels, together with businesses, civil society and scientists, to demonstrate climate leadership, drive action and unlock the opportunities of the green transition. Following a summer of devastating flooding, record-breaking heat and droughts across many parts of the world, the second half of this year was always going to be a crucial one for our aim to get the world on track to halt global heating. And in many ways, for us, this year kind of gets going and got going last September in New Delhi with the G20, followed by Climate Group's Climate Week NYC, and now leading to here at COP28. At the G20, the Indian government embraced its leadership role, successfully bringing together the world's biggest economies to achieve consensus around the new development model, one based on the need for equity, climate justice, and opportunities for the decarbonisation of economies, giving birth to new clean industries and jobs. From a commitment to triple renewable capacity to a new model of development with the announcement of the Green Development Pact, the calls of G20 leaders echo at this year's COP. But it's now time to turn rhetoric into action. The transformation of the world's energy systems is a huge opportunity to build cleaner, happier, healthier, and more resilient societies. And with all of that in mind, I couldn't pass the mic over to a more suitable person than Sir Alok Sharma. Alok started his career as a chartered accountant, was an investment banker, and is currently an MP in the British Parliament. But he's probably best known as the COP26 president, who successfully steered the world towards the historic Glasgow Climate Pact, aiming to make the world cleaner, happier, healthier, and resilient. Alok, hand over to you.
I'm sorry that no one has applauded the fabulous thing that Helen said. Thank you. Look, friends, it's really great to be invited to speak at this event, and it's good to see old friends. I don't mean in age, but people I've known for a number of years now through this climate work, but also new friends here as well. One of the things that I learned to understand during the time that the UK held the COP presidency was that there is an arc in every year in terms of climate discussions. It isn't just what happens at the COP at the end of the year. And so what happens at the G7, what happens at UNGA, what happens at the sort of events that Helen talked about, and what happens at the G20 absolutely matter. When we held the COP presidency, we did it, we partnered with Italy, and I guess we were lucky it worked out that Italy also had the G20 and we had the G7. So we were able to ensure there was some triangulation in terms of what we were trying to achieve. Now, we all know that the geopolitics in the last couple of years has got pretty challenging. And we saw that at the G20 in Bali in 2022. I was there. And so I think actually it is a huge feather in India's cap that India, Prime Minister Modi, my friend Amitabh Kant, managed to get the agreement that they reached at the G20 in India. Is important for a number of reasons. One is that it did set the agenda that goes into this COP. So many of the elements that you see agreed as part of the Green Development Pact are featured here. One of the key elements, of course, being in terms of tripling of renewable energy capacity, and also finance, which is, in my view, unless you have the finance, you can't deliver. And so I think what India did, working with countries around the world, is to set a very clear agenda. Before you know how you solve the problem, you've got to work out what the problem or the issues are. And that's what India did, and I think deserves an enormous amount of credit for that. One of the things that I was involved with when we were doing COP, working with our friends in the Indian government, was on CDRI. And again, I know that has made progress as well. So what is my sort of hope and expectation coming into this COP? Well, I hope we will see, and I think we can be sort of fairly confident that we're going to get the tripling of renewables energy capacity across the world. I think we will get the doubling of energy efficiency. I think we will get language on more hydrogen, a reduction in methane. But one of the areas that I think we are going to have to address, and this COP has to address, is the issue of fossil fuels, right? We have to address that. And we tried that at COP 27 last year, and actually India was one of the countries that stepped forward and talked about language on phase down of fossil fuel. And it's a recognition of the fact that 75% of all energy emissions are energy related. All emissions globally are energy related, 75%. And therefore you have to tackle this issue of fossil fuel production and use. And look, I think for very many people, they understand that this is a transition. This is not something that happens overnight. You don't turn off the taps overnight. You can't do that economically anyway. But we do need to have a clear plan coming out of this COP for that, and we need to see that reflected in the outcomes of the Global Stocktake. You will have seen, some of you, what's been published this morning in terms of some of the elements that are up for discussion, and clearly language on fossil fuel, on coal phase out is still in the mix. Just a second thing I want to say is on finance. We know that there are lots of countries that have ambitious NDCs. But we also know that for many developing countries, it's a question of financing some of it themselves and some of it from external sources. And that, again, is something that we have to try and solve in these kind of forums. And that money, a lot of it has to come from the private sector. So we all talk about billions to trillions. Well, let's see how we can move that forward. Let's see what messages we get from the multilateral development banks in terms of sweating their balance sheets more. Let's see what kind of messages we get in terms of first lost capabilities and products put in place by MDBs, and how we get the private sector to deliver more finance, because that is absolutely what is needed. And the final thing I want to say here is the human element of all of this, right? We talk in the billions, we talk in the trillions, we talk in the gigawatts and terawatts and all the rest of it. This is about people individually across the world. And I want to end by telling you a story. So when I was our International Development Secretary in the UK government, one of the first visits I did was to Kenya. And I went to see a family. There was a young man called Neville, who I still sort of see in front of me. And their lives had been transformed, because they, instead of running their lives and their power on sort of kerosene, they'd got solar panels put on top of their houses. And that meant that Neville was able to study in the evenings. And the last I heard is that he was doing pretty well in his studies and sort of moving on. And they didn't have all the sort of pollution that comes from kerosene. And for me, that was a really early example of seeing with my own eyes how lives can be transformed when you have a clean energy transition and you basically help people to help themselves. And I hope that's what we'll get coming out of this COP. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for India and all the sterling work done through the G20. But this is a time for action, and countries have to wake up and make the right decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'm going to ask Helen Mountford to join us. Helen's the President and CEO of ClimateWorks Foundation. Helen.
Thanks so much, Helen, and wonderful to be here with all of you and to follow on Alex's words, because I'll actually echo some of those and speak a little bit more about this. I think what was achieved by India and the G20 with the Green Development Pact was really substantial. That was enormous. And the arc we have between India's G20 presidency, Brazil, and then South Africa to carry it forward and to work with these other institutions, whether it's the COP and the UN system, whether it's the G7, whether it's the Africa Climate Summit, others, World Bank, IMF meetings. That is really powerful over the next 2 years, how we can move this forward. So, do want to congratulate and thank India for that leadership, all that was done there, and all those who helped them to deliver this Green Development Pact. It does identify and promote a new model of development. It is one which recognizes that we can't have economic development without climate action. We can't have climate action without economic development. We need to do these hand in hand, and we can. We have the opportunities to do so, and in a way that benefits people, that benefits the planet, and aligns with what Global South countries are calling for and working towards in their own countries. It also does recognize the role of individual action, including through the Lifestyle for Environment Initiative, the LIFE Initiative, as well as for changes in production and consumption, and doing so across the balanced pillars of climate action: mitigation, adaptation, capacity, finance, and technology. It's an exciting moment as we move forward to how to actually implement this, how to integrate it in the discussions and the decisions here in COP. And I want to highlight a few of the areas that I think are critical as we go through these next 2 weeks, what we can get from the Green Development Pact, what we can land further here from those G20 discussions and decisions that India led, and move forward. One is, again, definitely on the energy transition. Right? Absolutely need to triple renewable energy, need to double energy efficiency by 2030, but we also need to do this in a way where we're phasing out fossil fuels. That can't be done. We can't do one part of it without the rest of it. We need to do these both to really move things forward. And we know that these actions will have development benefits. They'll have development benefits in terms of air pollution and the health impacts. 7 million people each year die from air pollution worldwide. So the air pollution benefits, energy security benefits, benefits in terms of new jobs, opportunities, lower electricity prices for households, for small businesses, and the ability for those who don't have electricity, don't have light, can't do reading, studying, or develop themselves to do so. So there's great opportunities, and that's something which in the Global Stocktake, seeing that balanced package of how to do the energy transition, both developing the new and the clean and phasing out the polluting, is going to be essential. And again, it echoes what India put forward in Glasgow of phasing out, ending all fossil fuels. So this is the time for countries to come behind what India has proposed and move that forward. Another area of the G20 Development Pact that's really important to pick up here in the Global Stocktake is the phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. This is something I worked on at OECD for many years and with many partners around the world, and remember well back in 2009 when the G20 agreed to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies over the medium term. And back in 2009, the discussions were, is this medium term 3 years? Is it 5 years? Nobody expected that now, almost 15 years later, we saw record levels of fossil fuel subsidies last year. Absolutely record levels we haven't seen before. G20 countries spent an amazing $1.4 trillion on fossil fuel subsidies. Now just imagine if those funds had instead gone to getting clean, affordable, accessible energy to all. We could have achieved a lot. So this is the time we must stop using public taxpayers' money in this way. We need to shift that and transition quickly. And this is a moment here with the Global Stocktake to move that forward. A third area I want to mention that's in the Green Development Pact, and really something that has to be a focus here, is, again, echoing Alec, is really on the climate finance agenda. There's so much that needs to be done here and outside of the COP as we move forward, delivering on past promises, setting new targets. Yesterday, exciting to see what came forward on loss and damage. Well over $400 million already committed to the loss and damage fund. Much more is needed. but it's an important start. And we need to do more. And outside these halls, the role of the international financial institutions, how they can be better fit for purpose to really help support countries move forward, is going to be incredibly important, as well as further G20 discussions and other fora. A fourth area is really on building resilience and financing adaptation, which has now become an issue, an existential issue and crisis for many countries. We really need to be able to move this forward. And this is something in the discussions here on the Global Goal on Adaptation is going to be a really important focus, and one that was highlighted in the Green Development Pact. This includes building much more resilient food systems and getting food security for all, better incomes for farmers. It includes enabling economic diversification and really supporting social and economic prospects, different prospects for women. Given these outcomes, one of the things I would like to briefly say is just what role can philanthropy play? I'm coming from the philanthropic sector. At ClimateWorks, we help support and work with philanthropy and foundations around the world to do more on climate, to move quicker, collaboratively, to get funding targeted to the ground to support people and the planet. And one of the things we do is also look very closely at some of the numbers. How is the money being used? What's it being used for? How does it go forward? Philanthropic funds are always going to be small compared to what we'll see in public and private sector, but can be so catalytic and can help to leverage the public and private sector and really drive action in ways that we can take risks which often others can't. So that's how we're looking at how do we use these and use these well. And we just recently released a new report on the philanthropic funds that are going to climate action. They have increased significantly in recent years, increasing by 4 times since 2015. So now it was about $3.7 billion in 2022 going to climate action. But they still remain a small percentage of overall global philanthropy, so less than 2% of global philanthropy. Important, and we need to increase it, and it has been increasing, but we need to go even faster. We know we're not yet on track. What we are seeing is a lot more coordination and collaboration in the philanthropic sector, working together much more. We're also seeing a much stronger increase in focus on key geographies outside the global north. To be frank, most of the climate philanthropy funds have gone to supporting climate action in the US, Canada, and EU. About 60% at the moment that's region or country specific, but this is shifting. And we've started to see it really shifting, and that's something we're trying to support as we move forward. In Africa alone, we saw a tripling in funds since 2018 and a 40% surge in the last year. From ClimateWorks side ourselves, in terms of the re-granting we do, the vast majority, about 75%, goes outside the EU and US. It goes internationally to the global south, and we're working with others to try and ramp that up further. There's also a new focus and interest in looking at adaptation a lot more, not just mitigation in climate philanthropy. And this has been really welcome. There's some who've been doing that already, but we're trying to bring in more. And finally, a big focus is really bringing a people-centered approach, a people-centered and justice approach to all that we do in climate philanthropy and move that forward. So now we have this opportunity, and really excited to work with all of you and others outside here to take the Green Development Pact, land some of the elements in this broader forum here at COP, and go forward over the next 2 years in the arc to Brazil to really keep this moving. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. And I'm hoping now, looking at my technical people, there's a nod, that we've got a video. We were hoping to have Amitabh Kant, the G20 Sherpa, dialing in, but technology won't let us do that. But he's recorded a message for us. So I'm hoping. There we go.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, namaskar and a warm greeting to all of you. We stand at a moment of history where the choices we make today will echo for generations, shaping the legacy we leave for those who follow. Climate change has wrought significant changes globally, yet it impacts disproportionately, affects developing countries in the global south. Developmental progress, where a lack of sufficient funds and resources is forcing nations to choose between fighting for their people or the planet. Food security remains a critical challenge in emerging economies and the G20 is committed to focus on increasing agricultural productivity through innovations and investments. By championing the cultivation of climate-resilient and high-nutrition crops such as millets, we can move towards more sustainable agricultural systems without compromising on any country's right to adequate food. Developed countries must acknowledge their role in historic carbon emissions and incentivize emerging economies for their green transition. As we kickstart COP28 discussions, we must remember that the nations most vulnerable to climate change are not the cause of it. Crafting the right policy mix, ensuring fairness for renewable energy companies, strengthening market structures, mobilizing private investments, removing regulatory barriers, and supporting a credible, transparent, and equitable system holds the key to significantly bolstering green energy markets. In the wake of these challenges, our expectations for COP28 are clear. The G20 seeks a comprehensive roadmap on climate finance, capacity building, and technology transfer, all critical components of our global efforts. Energy security and access are imperative for poverty reduction and sustainable development. In nations on the brink of significant progress, the main challenge for developing countries lies in the decarbonization of hard-to-abate sectors of electricity generation, industrial operations, and transport, all essential to their growth. As such, the financial support outlined in the G20 Leaders' Declaration calling for $5.8 to $5.9 trillion in the pre-2030 period is indispensable to our transition to cleaner energy sources. The G20 achievements under India's presidency have set a solid foundation. Under the Green Development Pact, we have championed key initiatives: the establishment of G20 voluntary principles on hydrogen, the commitment to tripling global renewable energy capacity by 2030, and the emphasis on scaling up investment in climate finance mark significant milestones. Tripling global renewable energy capacity is no small feat, but it is necessary for averting 7 billion tons of CO2 emissions by 2030. This commitment from the G20 provides a head start for COP28. Moreover, the recognition of the need to substantially scale up investment in climate finance from billions to trillions of dollars resonates as a clarion call to governments, pension funds, investors, and markets. Our efforts go beyond boundaries. The inclusion of the climate vulnerable African Union as a permanent member of the G20 demonstrates our commitment to amplifying the voices of those most affected by climate change. By doing so, we can expect greater emphasis on implementation and accountability in the decisions made at both G20 and COP28. In pursuit of environmentally sustainable and inclusive economic growth, the G20 has addressed not only the supply side, but also unsustainable consumption patterns. The G20 high-level principles on lifestyle for sustainable development and the focus on circular economy, extended producers' responsibility, and the resource efficiency underscore our commitment to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. Prime Minister Modi's vision emphasizes that climate action must uplift the last person in our global society. In the past year, the G20 has successfully brought consensus on action-oriented decisions. We have provided a strong signal for enhancing ambition, inspired optimism for increased investment, and ensured a strengthened voice for the Global South in shaping the future of climate mitigation and SDGs. As we look forward to the negotiations of COP28, the G20 achievements can play a vital role in guiding discussions on climate action built on justice and equity. It is essential that the Global South continues to be a focal point, anchoring our collective commitment to a more inclusive, sustainable future for every corner of our interconnected world. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Feels odd clapping a screen, but we're very grateful that he managed to record that at short notice. We've got time for one question, I think, for Alok and Helen. I don't know if you want to join us. They've got it would like a band with microphones. Does anyone have a question who would like to ask our panelists a quick question?
Any song requests?
Otherwise, we will do karaoke.
Can I, sorry, Helen, were you going to go first? No, I was just going to make one particular point, which I want to pick up on, which Helen talked about, was the role of philanthropy. So I've recently joined the Rockefeller Foundation as a Climate and Finance Fellow. And my colleague, Elise Larkin, who is here in the red dress, so you can't miss her. You can't miss her. We're working together at the Rockefeller Foundation, and one of the things that the foundation has now done is effectively a sort of pivot to climate. So looking at everything through a climate lens. And that, for me, is really vitally important. And actually, if you have a look at what Rockefeller has done working with other philanthropies, for instance, in the Bridgetown Agenda, supporting that, Bridgetown 2, all of that is really important. So, and Helen's right. I mean, if you look at the amount of money that philanthropy has, it's been growing, but in the sort of sense of needing trillions, of course it's not there. But what it is able to do is to provide a catalyst, right, to get work started. And one other area where I have certainly seen this is through the GEAP. GEAP. Anybody know what GEAP is? The Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which was launched at COP26, and it encompasses funding from Rockefeller, Bezos, I think IKEA foundations, and sort of various others as well. And that is helping to provide finance to get energy transition going across developing nations. And one of the areas it's been particularly helpful is on the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, where a small amount of grant funding can help to unlock larger amounts of money from the public and private sector. So, I've certainly seen for myself the value of what philanthropies do, and I very much echo what Helen said about them.
Thank you.
Any other questions for our panelists before we thank them? No, I think you've given us a very good overview, and the themes.
Either that or we've bored them.
No, I think you've stunned them with your insights. The themes I heard coming out very strongly from both of you was this kind of implementation to action, the people side of it, and we know that's kind of the big impact. But also, I'm really glad that everyone's talking about fossil fuel phase out, and I think we all know this is COP where we have to get serious about it. And as a sort of preview, Climate Group has a report coming out on Monday, which I hope you will read. It's about barriers to renewable energy in the G20, because we've got to triple renewables, but there's a lot of policy things. The real problems in getting renewables up is not the building, it's all the policy and regulation. So I hope you all download down your report and act on it. So please join me in thanking our speakers. Fantastic. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Ratish Balakrishnan, co-founder and managing partner at Sattva. He's going to take us through the next section of our session, which will include a panel to discuss the outcomes of the G20 a bit further. So over to you, Ratish.
Thank you, Helen, and hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm really going to build on the thoughtful remarks that have already been shared on what we've been discussing. Sattva had a chance to be part of the G20 deliberations that happened in India. And one of the critical things that we actually wanted to speak about there is the Green Development Pact that sets the context for the discussion today. I think it was said very well by Sarah. I like that the G20, the G7 often help in furthering the conversation in COP, and they continue to contribute to moving the conversation forward. And the reason for that, I think, is important. It's essentially because, in a way, G20 brings together the countries that have the vast impact on the economic choices we make, 80% of all production that we're talking about, but also have the population that is actually impacted by these choices as well. 85% of the world's population lives in G20. So you're sort of bringing in the countries that have the most significant impact on climate, but also the countries that are most impacted by climate as well. And having alignment on critical challenges that we are facing at the G20 level goes a long way in catalyzing action in forums like COP. Yeah? And hence, it is extremely critical for us to be able to understand some of these deliberations at G20, because they set the tone for the conversation that we're going to have through the next few days. And talking about G20 requires us to understand how the Global South looks at the problems of what we're talking about as opposed to the Global North. If you look at just SDG performance today, the laggards in some form, all the lines in green, are Global South countries. So the trade-off, and I think Helen rightly brought it up, the trade-off between growth, development versus climate is clearly felt in these countries. It is about not making an or decision, but an and decision. If the choice of climate is going to happen at the cost of growth, or if the choice of growth is going to happen at the cost of climate, they're unsustainable choices. And this choice is pronounced for the Global South, because their political viability, their ability to serve their own populations, and their ability to seize the opportunity of growth is as critical to them as their commitment to meet the climate agenda. And in some sense, one of the achievements or highlights of the current discussions we had in the G20 anchored by India is that it called out that tension very, very clearly. There is a tension here that you see between the development agenda and the climate agenda. And it is an and of those that is going to really help us. And similarly, consumption-led growth and investment-led growth. And the reason why aspects like life become critical is that it is important for us to acknowledge that consumption is not going to go down, but it's the way we consume, it's how we consume that has to significantly evolve and change, and that is also something that we have captured as part of that thinking. And in some sense, at the center of the choices that we're going to discuss, I'm sure in the panel discussion, is this inherent tension between development and climate and the growth that we have to lead through consumption and investment. The Green Development Pact itself highlights 10 critical focus areas. I'm going to leave them on the screen for all of you to go through it, and we might not have sufficient time to go through each of these, but I do want to highlight a few of them. But as you will see them, it is the choice of and is actually very clearly apparent. You talk about sustainable and inclusive transitions, ensuring that sustainability is achieved, but in a manner that's good for the people and is just in its transition. The discussion on lifestyle for sustainable development, or LIFE as we call it, essentially makes the argument that consumption is going to be critical for the growth of the country, but how we consume, how we ensure circularity, and the choices we make on simple things like where we live, what we eat, how we move, are going to have a significant impact on how we look at the climate agenda as well. Similarly, the circular economy, how do we redesign or design the economy in a way where it functions effectively, but it holds its responsibility towards the climate agenda? I think some of these are going to be very, very critical choices. Of course, finance is going to be a big question. It's an interesting take when you say, are we talking millions, billions, or trillions? So it's not whether we're talking of a few hundred or 1,000 millions more. It's actually the unit of measure that we are shifting. And not only that, is also where that financing is going to. Global South is increasingly aware and conscious of its adaptation needs. But are the adaptation needs taken into account as we look at financing as well? So those are some aspects of the Green Development Bond. I think everyone's talked about it. The fossil fuel phase out, phase down, conversations are going to be critical. I think the good news is, of course, the fact that we've broadened the agenda for our energy needs to talk about tripling renewable energy, but also look at a global biofuel alliance and also look at green hydrogen. While those are important, the choice that we make on fossil fuels continues to be critical. And it is inherently, and as someone who's been from India and been to these very states that depend on coal, the choices that we make and the trade-offs are actually very clear. These are not just positions that are taken. I think the criticality of those choices and how we address them, I think, is going to be important. I know that the panel is going to speak more about this as we go in the next session, so I welcome that opportunity for all of you to engage in that discussion as well. Life, again, as we've talked about, is a very, very critical choice because consumption is going to be critical. And like I had mentioned earlier, the 80% of all the choices we make are around 4 big things, which is where do we live, how do we eat, what do we buy, and how do we move, And these choices actually have the most significant impact on climate as well. How do we bring in fairness and equity? How do we bring in the principle of circularity? How do we bring in innovation in actually thinking of sustainable ways of production? And lastly, how do we do this in a way that is respectful of the local communities from where some of these elements are sourced and managed, I think is going to be very, very important. And one of the highlights for me in making life as part of the agenda is the fact that it puts the person and the person's choices at the center of this dialogue as well. And so it makes everyone a participant in the conversations that we are having today as an economy. Lastly, I think, and everyone's been talking about it in every session, the positive signaling we had yesterday on the Loss and Damage Fund is a good move. But I think, like I'd mentioned, it's not just about meeting the millions right now, it's meeting the trillions that we are talking about. And I know, so the problem is running faster than the solution in this particular case. So how do we look at our engagement there? That's one, which is really making the money come through. But secondly, and again, I'm sure there is a discussion around this in the panel as well, how do we look at where that money is going to between mitigation and adaptation? How do we have a view across here and now needs that countries are facing today to mitigation attempts that are necessary for us to work on, and building the right form of stewardship for both increasing the amount of capital but also streamlining the flow of capital, I think is going to be critical. And while there are other aspects for us, these critical questions around the issue of life, the issue of fossil fuels, and the issue of finance are actually very, very critical for the discussion that we're going to have. It is every year, and I shared a cab ride today to come to this occasion, and we were talking about how sometimes it seems like every year we have a lot of these conversations, and you ask ourselves where they lead to, but we are building it brick by brick. And every event like this is an opportunity for us. And what we hope, speaking on the early days of this conversation, is really that we use this opportunity to define what is our ambition towards what we want to do. What are those opportune places where we have to shift the agenda? And while this is going to be a long road, how do we be more aggressive about the short-term milestones that we need to achieve as well? I hope that sets the agenda. Andrew, I hand it over to you now to take the discussion forward. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Satish. Now, invite our excellent panel to come up, please, and we'll take these chairs here. Please, come on up. I think the three of you over there. Sorry, a little bit of stage management.
I'll just sit here. Maybe take that one and I'll give you this one.
The first few days of COP were into the logistical things.
So don't fall off
We'll have to pass it over.
Very awkward.
Oh, there we go.
I think we can share.
I'm going to trip over this one. Right. Thank you very much, Satish. I'm Andrew Prague, Managing Director for Policy at the We Mean Business Coalition. So it's my pleasure to welcome you actually to this pavilion, the Business and Buildings Pavilion, which we co-host as the We Mean Business Coalition. Pleasure to have such excellent speakers already. Lovely to see Helen Mountford, who is my boss at the OECD many years ago. So great to see you, Helen. And congratulations to everyone for finding this place already on day 2 of COP. A very good performance to get you all up here, so well done. So yes, it's we're excited to have this panel now. This big ask of decoding the Green Development Pact is no small order, but we've already had a lot of very fascinating insights from the speakers, and looking forward to getting into some of these details now. Just to say, firstly, who is the We Mean Business Coalition? Since I talked about it, well, we are an international NGO working with the most influential businesses around the world to get better action on climate change, trying to bring that progressive business voice into policymaking circles, including here at the UNFCCC, but also, of course, at the G20 and the G7. So very happy to be engaging now on issues around decoding the G20 agreement. Our big push at COP this year is on fossil fuels, our campaign called Fossil to Clean, really getting businesses to push to say that they will be phasing out fossil fuels. They need the governments, the finances, the supply side to follow suit. And that, of course, is a big issue for G20, as we've been hearing, and we'll get into that a bit more coming up. It's fantastic to take a moment to talk about G20, actually, at the COP, because it's very easy to get wrapped up in just the UNFCCC, so it's really good to keep this longer-term perspective and this continuity as the COP will come and go, and then we'll be into the G20, and that's very important. And in particular, I'm delighted to have this panel because we've had this very important succession of Global South countries holding the presidency of the G20, starting with Indonesia, and then, of course, India this year, Brazil next year, South Africa the year after. So here we have represented India, Brazil, and South Africa in different capacities. And that's, I'm really pleased to have this continuity to be able to discuss how these priorities are evolving. I don't want to do a long introduction, so let me turn now to the excellent panel. I'll just introduce them quickly. Firstly, we have Seema Arora in the middle here, who is the Deputy Director General of the Confederation of Indian Industry. She has a very long track record in the field, more than 30 years experience. And we were talking earlier, she was already involved with the World Business Council Sustainable Development in the run-up to the Rio Summit 1992, so very impressive credentials. So great to have you here with us. Then we have Lucas Padilla from the Rio de Janeiro, who's the International Affairs and Cooperation Coordinator in the Mayor's Office of Rio de Janeiro, City of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Also chair of the Mayor's Coordinating Committee for the G20 next year. And we have Romy Chevalier, who is the lead researcher at the South African Institute for International Affairs, with a focus on climate adaptation and nature. So let's begin just to ask each of you what you see as the most important one or two key takeaways from the G20 in India this year, and how that's relevant for COP28. Maybe I'll start with you, Seema, as you bear the responsibility of having been very involved with this G20 presidency from the business side in the B20.
Thank you, and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. CII was very closely involved with the G20. As you know, we were the business engagement group B20, and we led the inputs from the business into the the leaders' declaration. I think, as was mentioned by almost all the speakers in the opening plenary, I think the leaders' declaration endorsing the Green Development Pact itself is a very, very major outcome, and something that we are very proud of, because it really sends a very clear signal, as was mentioned, that this is not a choice that we have to make. We have to really make sure all our choices are balanced and aligned with the Green Development Agenda as was put forward. So I think that's a major key takeaway. From a business point of view, I think we believe that there's a lot that needs to be done, but partnerships are essential, collaborations are essential, and I think the announcements of having different alliances, the Hydrogen Innovation Center, having the Global Biofuel Alliance, and saying that this is important is also something as a key takeaway that we see. This is something that B20 also said, that it's very important that we build more coalitions, more alliances, whether they are sector-specific or they are, related to certain outcomes. This was something that we were very keen on. I think finally, everybody's talked about it, the energy transition, and that's again where business is a key stakeholder. Just bringing out all those very action-oriented goals of tripling renewable energy efficiency, tripling renewable energy, doubling energy efficiency, just putting those numbers out there, I think is a really crucial takeaway. So I just want to mention these to begin with, and then we'll go with the flow.
Thank you. Excellent and very succinct points to get going with. We're going to dig in more into the energy transition point. Next, same question to Lucas then. What do you see as the key one or two takeaways from India taking forward to the COP28?
So one very interesting fact from India is that engagement groups, they were really meaningful for the overall achievements of the country. So at the U20, at the Urban 20, I had the pleasure to be the Sherpa for the Urban 20. We got this commitment, so cities will be a part of the discussion of MDB reform. This is a very interesting thing. Climate action is local action, and we need cities to get funded that. So the U20 was very vocal on this regard, and we want to keep it moving forward. At the G20 in Brazil, and Rio will be the capital of the G20 and the president of the U20. So India built a very interesting road for Brazil, and the G20 is now a climate forum led by presidents and finance ministers. I'm not trying to be reductive of it, but this is a very interesting fact. It's a heavily political multilateral forum. It's not UNFCCC. Both systems, they work. They have different ways of doing things. But the G20 seems to be here to stay in terms of creating new terms for climate change and for climate action. So the Biofuels Alliance, for example, it's a very interesting thing. You put Brazil, India, huge producers of foodstuff and energy that need to transition with a new kind of fuel. And South Africa as well is part of that, and Mauritius and other interesting countries, small and big, from the south and north. And now President Lula is really interested in making this a G20 that works around the theme of phasing out fossil fuels by using biofuels. It can be really important to bridge development and climate action. You create jobs, you create commodities with higher level, and this is really meaningful for industries, for people, and for cities. Rio, for example, is the capital of energy in Brazil. 85% of our oil and gas industry is there. we need to find new ways. It's not possible to phase out and lose all of our royalties. Other way, how can we adapt? How can we finance our adaptation? So maybe biofuels is a way, but we need to go further and to accelerate action. And I think G20 is moving in that direction. Led by India, did an amazing job. And today is the first day that Brazil presides the G20. It starts at a COP. So President Lula became the president of the G20 today at the COP. And I would like to mention as well the presence here of city councilmen of Rio de Janeiro, elected officers from our local parliament that are participating at this COP and are really engaged in how the legislative branch, the executive branch at a city level can move forward climate action under local governments. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, and well, congratulations for officially taking on the mantle of the G20, and welcome to the participants from Brazil, from Rio. And then before we get into a bit more detail on those points, Romy, same to you. What are your key questions?
So I guess I obviously had very similar reflections, but I guess the invitation to include the African Union in the G20, I'm obviously going to speak about Africa and South Africa, but I think it's a massively significant development to have, from the perspective of bridging the divides between the North and the South, the developed and the developing countries. I think we all need to recognize that there are still, as much as we're furthering strategic partnerships and collaboration, there's still massive divisions between the North and the South. And obviously the Indian presidency in the G20 is doing a lot to further some of those opportunities and challenges. And obviously with the presence of Africa, and I think we'll go into what those priorities look like now, it starts to bring the climate development conversations to the fore, very much around, not that the mitigation, maybe mitigation conversations to date have featured most prominently in the G20, but for African countries, adaptation and loss and damage are by far the key priorities under the climate action agenda. So the fact that those have been put on the table, they're priority areas, we're speaking about vulnerable people, we're speaking about impacts to communities and economies, I think is a critical development and one that is very welcomed.
Yeah, great, thank you very much. And I was hoping you'd mention this arrival of the African Union as a permanent member at the table. It's a hugely important step and increases the emphasis towards Global South priorities. Maybe I'll ask you more about that right away, actually. You mentioned therefore maybe more of a focus on adaptation, loss and damage. Of course, breakthrough here already yesterday with the authorization of the loss and damage fund. But in terms of the G20, what expectations do you have on the adaptation side of things? When we saw in Satish's slide, as always, the segment of finance for adaptation is small. Yeah. What do you think the G20 can do in that front, especially given the African presence? Okay,
well, let me start at the beginning, I think. So the African Union, so obviously it's also prior to this, obviously South Africa was the only African country that was represented amongst the G20. So with the arrival of the African Union represents 55 AU member countries of Africa. So the first thing that it does, it brings a very different set of countries and circumstances and issues onto the table. So South Africa is quite unique in the African context. It has a very specific set of development concerns, energy-related concerns. We're very dependent on coal. 90% of our electricity is from coal-based electricity. So we have very different priorities to different other countries which sit in different categories. So what the African Union does, and it has done so for the last couple of years, it's very clearly articulated its priorities related to climate change. We see that at other policy forums, recently the Africa Climate Summit that took place in September. We see, and out of that came something called the Nairobi Declaration, which clearly articulates what African interests are, very clearly. So it says specifically what it wants from an international financial reform perspective, which is, it's got action points saying, very clearly asking for financial architecture to reform and to change, in line with developing country concerns, in line with debt-related issues and perpetuating debt-related issues. It calls for the reform of the IMF, the World Bank, and it gives very specific recommendations as to how it wants to see that being done. It also clearly articulates that adaptation, loss and damage are a priority for the continent, and it calls for very specific support from the international community and from its partners in the G20. So, for example, it speaks about the just energy transition and says, well, many of our countries transitioning need support. We cannot do it. So it comes back to obviously the fact that we're willing to take a lead, but we need a lot of the transitional support. So whether it be in terms of finance, whether it be in terms of capacity, skills development, a country like South Africa moving away from coal will require an entire industry to be developed. So these are real realities. And adaptation finance at the moment has been lacking. There's been a clear focus at the moment on global finance going to mitigation, very little to Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is that the African Union clearly articulates what it wants, and it's going to be very interesting to have it on a platform like the G20, where it can very strongly push the needs for the rest of the continent. So loss and damage, adaptation, all of that will be front and center. And then, I mean, I can go into some of the specifics around the global goal for adaptation. I mean, there's some very clear asks, and it aligns strongly with the justice conversation. So, yeah, those will keep, I think, keep those issues at the front and center of what's being discussed in the G20.
Absolutely. Thanks for getting into that detail. And I guess none more so than in 2025 when South Africa takes up the presidency with the African Union also present. Great. Thank you very much for that. Now I'll turn back to the energy transition side. So we heard a lot earlier about India's achievements in kind of keeping the show on the road at the G20 this year, and which is no mean feat in itself, given the geopolitical tensions and the energy crisis that's been covering the world the last 2 years. And so, quite an impressive outcome on climate, not perfect by any means. And as we've been hearing from the speakers earlier, the lack of concrete language on fossil fuel phase out. Business was quite prominent in that, pushing for greater ambition there. And we actually, as Women in Business, together with the Climate Group, we coordinated a letter of Indian businesses writing to the G20 just before the summit to really push for more ambition, which I found really exciting and inspiring. That it wasn't the usual suspects in the business world. This was purely a big Indian businesses pushing for this. So business was pushing hard for that ambitious outcome. But given where we did get to in terms of energy transition in the G20 Declaration, what do you think the COP can do more to take forward those themes, be it on the renewables or the fossil fuel side of things?
So yeah, I think we have from CII a very large delegation here at the COP28. And why are they here? I mean, we have, if I could say, there are 2 or 3 types of businesses here largely renewable energy companies, because they see a huge opportunity. And I think businesses are smart. They know that they need to capture the opportunity. And when there is a goal like, tripling renewable energy capacity put out in the G20, we expect that the COP will also kind of put out maybe some targets which are very clearly laid out for now countries to adopt. Maybe they would also say that, how do we look at it across the entire renewable energy space in an integrated manner, including battery storage, including all of the storage options, etc. Because right now it's very fragmented. We look at solar, we look at, but how do we put it all together? Because if we are talking about tripling renewable energy capacity, we have to look at all sources of renewable energy, and the entire ecosystem has to be put together. Maybe COP can also kind of give a roadmap of creating low carbon hubs, where equipment suppliers, financiers, supply chain partners, etc., could all be together. So both the demand and the supply side could, and you can get different segments of customers also into it. So maybe there could be a roadmap. So we see a lot of interest on this particular from this particular COP in terms of taking forward the G20 goal of tripling renewable energy and putting it into action. And I try to, enumerate some of those action points that we think are possible. I think similarly for energy efficiency doubling, we have with us in our delegation people who are from the hard-to-abate sectors, right? And there I think the lowest hanging fruit is around energy efficiency, process changes, looking at those technological options. So I think even in this COP, a lot more should be about how do we bring technology access more clearly to these sectors which need to decarbonize and transition at a much faster pace, and especially for the global south. I mean, I think a lot of the times we forget that the circumstances are different. I thank her for actually pointing that out again, that they are very different for the global south, and therefore special, considerations are required. Finally, also a couple of more points. I think MSMEs deserve a different kind of a thought process. I think the COP should talk about, because no transition will be complete if we don't look at the MSME sector. And I think the COP itself should recognize it. Do we need a green fund for MSMEs in the global south to really make this transition? Because there's no way we'll have net zero if we don't look at the MSME sector in a different manner. We work with industry all the time in India and in other parts, and we see that they're really struggling. So there needs to be that recognition and emphasis there. I think on the, we talked about the Global Biofuel Alliance, and I think COP should recognize that, again, should encourage more members to join, more countries to join the Global Biofuel Alliance, and several other alliances that have been, put together. But particularly from the G20 to COP, if we have to talk, it's the Global Biofuel Alliance. If we can have more countries join in and see how they can, take benefit, and again, bring it to scale so that you will have much more action, and bring it to scale in a good manner. So I think these are some of the points. One more thing, I think COP should also ask governments to put public green procurement targets out. And they must give these targets out and say, demand this, that countries do this. Because if we have to have this transition, we need to create, renewable energy supply side is galloping a little bit, but the demand side is still there, and we need to do that. So that will be fine.
Yeah, great, thank you so much there. I saw Helen here nodding vigorously on the green procurement side. So, I remember the OECD a decade ago, we were calling for that. But it's, the interesting thing now is that these are real markets that can be created. Back then it was a bit theoretical, making a market for low carbon steel or whatever. Whereas now all the technologies are there. This actually just needs that push. So yeah, it's a big difference. And on the MSMEs, yeah, thank you for raising that. That's certainly music to our ears in the Women in Business Coalition, because we have a big push on trying to make tools and approaches that are suitable for SMEs through our SME Climate Hub, which actually launched in India, as I'm sure you know, just before the G20, and also now in the MENA region in cooperation with the COP28 presidency. So yeah, that focus on those millions and millions of SMEs that can make or break the actions we do on climate change is very important. Put my phone on airplane mode, but then there was an alarm set. Shooting myself in the foot. Yeah, no, sadly not. Thank you again, Seema. So turning now maybe to Luca again. As you mentioned in your introduction, of course you represent the city government, the capital of the G20 in Brazil, as you put it, I think. What ways can you see local governments and city governments in particular having more of an influence in the G20? It's certainly something that's become more prominent in this process in the UNFCCC in a good way. And many mayors' initiatives, cities' initiatives, really pushing for greater representation and the real implementation that they can do at the city level. But now, with this great opportunity with Rio and Brazil, what do you see as ways that the G20 can embrace more the local and city angle of things?
We are truly excited because stars are aligning. So Mayor Paes, the current mayor of Rio, is the first mayor from the Global South to preside over C40, right? After Mike Bloomberg, which is a very interesting fact. And now he's the mayor of Rio again, and Lula is the president of Brazil again. So the politics are aligning. So you have a city very close to the national government. And Rio hosts that spirit from '92. Multilateralism, civil society participating in high-level discussions are part of our history. And for us, cities in places like COP and G20 are like civil society. They are asking for things, but on the other hand, they are also delivering for citizens. In a country like Brazil, almost everything needs to be funded or financed by cities. So what are we doing? Okay, we want to host events. We want to welcome people, throw very interesting parties and nice, things like India did. But hosting at the G20 is more than that for us. We are presiding the U20 with one single focus: MDB reform, new financial institutions for cities and made by cities and to cities. So now Mayor Paes is presiding over this commission with Mayor Hidalgo from Paris and Professor Jeffrey Sachs, called the SDSN Global Commission for Urban SDG Finance, because we need to look for the Paris Agreement and the SDGs in terms of finance, right? Not only in terms of 17 things that we are looking there and setting goals. In Rio, we have our climate budget is the first city in Latin America to put out a climate budget. Yesterday, we worked our way to get it done by COP. We have a climate action plan. So things are in place, but where is the money? Is the money coming from the national government? We think so. So today, we are at the local climate action summit, the first ever, right? Mayor Pais is putting forward this thing called CHAMP, this multi-level engagement, national governments, local governments. So if cities, they have everything they have been asked for. They have credit rates, they have funds, they have tax systems in place. Why is the money not pouring in to do adaptation? Because cities do adaptation. And we want to lead by example. So we are doing two things for G20 that are not related to events, okay? We are putting forward this blended finance fund for energy transition in Rio favelas and Rio areas, so local communities, small money, philanthropy is helping to scale up. We are trying to do it by ourselves, inspired by the National Development Bank of Brazil, BNDES, one of the largest banks in the world, the development banks in the world. We are working with them to put that forward next Monday. For the G20, we want not only you to visit Rio, but people to put money in Rio. Philanthropists, please come. ClimateWorks help us technically, at least. Capacity building. We welcome you. So we want to do that. This this blended finance fund for Rio, to use the G20 momentum. We want to use momentum to raise money, and we are also, trying to make the U20 carbon neutral. What does it mean? I don't know. It's very hard to neutralize an event like this, right? But we will try to do it at the city level, because cities, they like this thing, they like to be ambitious because they need the money. So we have to lead by example. So countries and multilateral development banks and national banks can't look at us and say, you don't have the projects. We have the money, you don't have the projects. We have to match those things, And we will try to do so by leading the U20, but also trying to develop local-led initiatives, policies that resembles that spirit of the G20, developmentalism and environmentalism in a new way. We have to do that. And cities are the perfect lab to fight and win the climate war, to put it that way. That's our war, right? That's where risk is. And cities, 80% of emissions are there. People know the numbers. So look at cities, invest in cities, because you will get action there. Mayors want to be re-elected. And this is a very good thing for cities in democracies. And cities in other countries that are not democracies, and the G20 is good because we have political diversity, they're also interested in doing their part, because they are the ones in charge of things like flooding, heat waves, Taylor Swift concerts. This kind of climatic events, they happen, and cities need to do them. So please come to Rio, and we will do our best to do something related to what cities can do in terms of climate action.
Right, no, thank you. Very inspiring case for the city level action on climate change, and also for Taylor Swift concerts. I think was it Taylor Swift that actually caused a seismic measurement in Sweden last year? There was a concert that
she caused a heat wave in Rio.
There you go. That's it.
Yes. 60 degrees Celsius feelings during her show.
So you need adaptation for
measure that.
But more seriously, thank you for bringing up this question of adaptation in cities, which of course really is where the hundreds of millions, billions of people are being affected by climate extremes in the global south and also the global north, in fact, and so what an important role for cities to be tackling that. And also for bringing forward the finance question. She brings me on to maybe a question I put to Seema on the global finance agenda. So you mentioned the MDB reform, Lucas, and Alok Sharma earlier talked about the Bridgetown initiative and that important setting. Of course, in this process here, as well as in the G20, this question of North-South finance more broadly has always been a thorny, difficult one. And right now, the questions of setting a new quantitative goal on finance by next year is a very tall order especially as we don't even know who's hosting that COP, let alone how to get that agreed. So in that context, how do you think the G20 next year can help to smooth a bit these difficult discussions on the North-South climate finance goal?
So I think we had very clearly in the, you mentioned in G20, the Leaders' Declaration, and even B20, we had very clearly some recommendations around climate finance, and both on the availability of the finance, which I think is still a question because we don't have enough finance, but more so also on the accessibility of the finance. Even if we have the finance, it's really not accessible to people who need it, especially the Global South. So I think even when we see commitments like we've seen yesterday, which is very good, will it really get accessible? And come to the places in an efficient manner. In an efficient manner is important, It's not just that you have it available and then it never reaches in the time when you need it, right? So making sure that climate finance is accessible and is accessible in an efficient manner is also very important. And I think here there is, of course, sweating the balance sheet of the MDBs to make it more available. There's also different types of, risk hedging mechanisms. For example, currency risk hedging mechanisms which need to be put into place. And I think India's G20 and even B20 had put that out very clearly. And I'm hoping that Brazil will, continue to talk about these issues because they are very important. I'm sure these can't be done in 1 year or 2 years, but we need to continuously flag these issues. And this is a major problem for the Global South, the currency hedging issue, really. So it needs to be, looked at. And I think also, where do we house these funds is important also. Always housing them in just the institutions that have always housed them may not be the right thing, and we need to look at the architecture in a different manner and say, how do we make it accessible? Also, who decides where these funds go, and in those decision-making bodies, what is the representation of Global South? That's also very important, because if the representation there is of the Global North, then we are not going to have the right kind of, again, this discord that you mentioned or the conflict is going to stay. So we need to have much more, I would say, parity there as well in terms of who's making those decisions. Private finance is very important. We mentioned that. I think somebody mentioned that when we were talking about. Now, private finance needs to flow. One of the things that we are noticing in our work in CII is that, this entire ESG discourse, the environment, social governance discourse, companies being rated on ESG parameters, very important, very good. But when you look at the list of indicators and the parameters, again, they are very, North-focused. And they're set by agencies of the North. Global South has no voice in it. So when you're actually doing the ESG rating of companies in South countries, some of the indicators are really out of context. And they're not disclosing that because we don't need to disclose them. For example, we don't have to, we probably need more emphasis on adaptation, as was mentioned, than mitigation right now. Okay, even for businesses, right? That is an important thing. The whole CSR, ecosystem in India is very different. And companies do a lot more CSR, but does the ESG indicators actually map that? Maybe not. So and therefore, there's a double whammy, as I call it. One, it's not available. What is available is not accessible because you are actually measuring the performance of companies, and private finance tends to do that, go by the ESG rating, and it never flows to who really needs it. So how do we get this going? Yeah.
Fascinating, thank you. And I think both you and Lucas are kind of setting up whole other events we could get into here, so on the appropriateness of ESG. and how to make a G20 carbon neutral. I let that one slip, but we could sit and discuss that for an hour probably. So yeah, thank you. Very interesting to hear your first points about how G20 can help sort of get under the skin of the finance question by proposing these tools to help with the currency hedging, with the access to finance, with cost of capital and so on. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. One thing I just wanted to raise before we run out of time is the word nature. We haven't heard much about so far. And Romeo, I know you've worked a lot on integrating nature into climate plans across Africa particularly, and also more generally. We hear a lot more in this process and more generally in the climate world about the importance of the biodiversity goals to integrate better climate policies with nature policies, but I find it tends to often be a bit high level, doesn't really address the serious trade-offs there can be between the two, as well as the synergies. And so it's wondering, again, with the G20 focus looking ahead and with your expertise, what can the G20 do in that regard to get a bit more real substance on this sort of integration of nature-climate question.
Thank you. Well, you've already introduced quite a few of the topics, but no, in a good way. Well, one of the things is that, I mean, obviously we expect that Brazil's G20, I think, will have a big ecosystem and nature-focused, I'm hoping. I'm sure it will. And South Africa's will as well. I mean, I think South Africa also is one of the countries that, natural resources are really important to our economy. We have important biodiversity, etc. So I know from the South Africa space, we will continue with the ecosystem side of things. But I think there's a lot that needs to happen in the COP space to integrate the biodiversity conversations. The biodiversity conventions still happen. I mean, all of these, the Rio conventions still happen in many ways in isolation, and as much as there's an attempt to integrate, the conversations are still growing. But I think there is obviously recognition around the importance of what we call ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solutions, where we clearly recognize the role of nature and ecosystems for their role in climate mitigation and adaptation. So if we ensure that our nature is healthy and robust and functioning well, these will provide us with a mass of climate benefits and development benefits. So the whole conversation around ensuring that we are providing for our people, but we're also looking after the environment is an important one, so that there's no trade-off. And I think there's a lot of conversation around how you then value nature, whether you, I'm not a fan, but whether you put like a quantifiable target on it or whatever it is, but there's a lot of conversation around ensuring that nature is viewed for all it's worth. And so those conversations are happening. There's a lot going on in the African context. So we've got big initiatives around conservation and preservation of nature, but also obviously restoration and around sustainable use and sustainable management, which for the developing countries is a real thing. It's not only about conservation and ensuring that so for example, there's a large debate around marine protected areas in the way that I work in coastal management a lot. And for a solution for the developing countries, it's not always about protection. It's about how you can ensure environmental integrity but allow sustainable use in some of those environments, because it is about the person, the fisher, that is dependent on that resource for their livelihoods and their jobs. So I think the conversations around the nexus with biodiversity, development, jobs, and climate change is a big one, which for the developing world is important. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on, but and then obviously in the finance side, there's a lot of conversation at the moment around these innovative financial modeling around the debt for climate adaptation, the debt for nature swaps, which is really interesting. So there's some very interesting work going on in that regard, where I'm sure you're all aware of the model, but where essentially it's debt is alleviated for in return for climate benefits, I could say, in an easy way to explain it. So hopefully it stays on the G20 agenda and it becomes more and more important.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I imagine because Brazil will be having it strongly on the agenda as part of the priorities more generally.
Absolutely. Brazil is creating a bioeconomy working group,
right, okay,
which is a very interesting thing. We have the climate one, we have, and the bioeconomy, it's interesting because it puts the bio back into the equation, and you need biodiversity. So I'd just like to go, maybe as a closing remark, I don't know. We have here Tainá. She's our Secretary for the Environment in Rio, in charge of the largest reforestation program in a city. And how does it work? We hire people from the favelas, so they replant around and inside favelas. So each favela a forest. So this is very G20. It's Global South, and it's creating jobs and low-emission jobs, And you pay people to do a good thing, to create another system. It's not valued yet, but maybe debt for biodiversity can be a way forward. So, those bad debtors can buy some biocredits to pay someone what they are, what they own. Maybe this is a good way of doing things. So conservation and restoration should be part of the bioeconomy conversation, and we think it will. Marina Silva, the environmental minister of Brazil, André Corrêa do Lago is the leading diplomat for climate change in Brazil. They are, people that are considering bioeconomy a very important thing. So we don't only discuss mitigation, but we go further and try to put forward new things on how to, do this bioeconomy in areas as important as the Amazon. How do you create jobs that are not mineration? how to create another mining. I'm sorry. How to create jobs that are not mining, are not deforestation. If we cut deforestation, illegal deforestation in Brazil, we can be the first G20 carbon neutral country by 2030. It's an absurd. That's our ambition, you know. Is it possible? I think so, but we have to discuss nature and forests.
Right, thank you for seconding that and showing the importance of the bioeconomy to Brazil next year. That will really stand up. So now, before we run out of time, I want to turn over to the floor, see if anyone has any questions for this excellent panel. Please say who you are and fire away. Anyone? Otherwise, I'm going to keep shooting questions at them, but you haven't got away yet. No one? Well, maybe you can keep thinking. Shoot up a hand at any time if you feel like it. Don't be shy. But one question I wanted to put to the panel, anyone who wants to take it, is something that Helen raised earlier on the question of fossil fuel subsidies. So, you know, it was one of the big, you know, it was one of the big topics of the creation of the G20. Way back it was Pittsburgh 2009, right, where this commitment on fossil subsidies came into being, and you know, obviously it's been tricky. It's only got trickier in the last couple of years with the energy crisis, and you know, the G7 is also struggling greatly with this. So they have their commitment for phasing out inefficient subsidies by 2025, which is right around the corner. But you know, from a G20 perspective, what do you see as any sort of ways that progress can be made in the next couple of years on this crucially important topic, which is obviously at the heart of the phasing out fossil fuels question, and you're going to get rid of the subsidies as well? Anyone want to take that easy question?
I don't know if I can talk from the G20 perspective, but from the country's perspective, I think I would say that a lot of the subsidies have been replaced, or rather, I wouldn't say that we've worked too much on the subsidy side, but we've put a lot of cesses on use of fossil fuels. So there's disincentives to use fossil fuels. Like there's a very large coal cess which has kind of gone up multiple times over the years. And that is something to disincentivize use of fossil fuels. So I think there are different ways of looking at it, you know. And I think, again, a lot of the people have shifted in households also to cleaner fuels. So the fossil fuels are not being subsidized. It's the cleaner fuels which are actually getting subsidized, so which is good. So it's a different way of looking at what you're saying, you know, that there are no fossil fuel subsidies is one way of one lens you use. But if you're incentivizing cleaner fuel adoption, that itself is very good as well, right? And I think that's the way you can actually change behavior and get over this entire thing of how do we phase out fossil fuel subsidies. You actually incentivize, you know, uptake of cleaner fuels, and people will stop using fossil fuels, and you won't have to subsidize them any longer. And that's, I think, a more creative way of doing it, and that's what we are trying to do in our country. I also want to just comment on the nature question, just taking since I have the mic, and I think today you would have heard, and if you haven't heard, please look up, the Prime Minister has actually announced the Green Credits program from India. And what that really does is it's, again, a incentive. It's a market-based program to promote nature conservation, promote restoration. It's also to promote individual action. So even an individual can actually get a green credit, a panchayat, a village, a community-based organization. And we also have to create a demand for this now, because who is incentivizing? People like, you know, the industry can actually take it and say that I'm actually buying this because I believe that I have a role to play in this. And so I think these are the kind of creative instruments that we have to think of, where we shift the behavior of the consumer, behavior of the community, and that's when you start to get the real transition, which is people-based, I think, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, thank you for providing a very interesting perspective on both parts, actually, on the fossil fuel subsidies and the nature side. Ask again if any questions from the floor. Otherwise, oh yes, please.
One question, I think it's firstly exciting to have an entire panel of global scientists. It was a powerful question.
Earth-shattering.
So that's people vehemently agreeing with me that it is great to have people. The question really is, and something Seema you touched upon as well, how do we increase the share of voice of Global South across all of these key forums? Because clearly these are the voices that should be heard more often, and I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on that.
Anyone want to tackle that? Remy?
Just trying to think. I might need to think about it a little bit longer. So okay, I'll just throw an answer out there. But I think it's also about, in many ways, so irrelevant of member countries. If we think about the voices, obviously we've been speaking about different actors, so the voices are coming from everywhere now. And in my mind, it's also around agency. So I work, for example, and I'm just going to take it out of the member countries and go into an actor group. So I work closely with, I do technical advisory work with the Farmers Union group for the whole of the East Africa region, so it's 25 million people. And so there's their secretariat that mobilizes all the regional farmer organizations and groups came forward and said, well, we want to be more involved. We want to know about these issues. So we're traditionally, obviously, they were in a food and agriculture, climate space. They want to know about these global forums and how they can engage. And so I've been working with them over the couple of years to increase their engagement, understanding and opportunity. So the work that I do is actually around specific designing a way that they have platform for intervention. So it's about saying to them, okay, take your messages and these are where you can intervene, because it's an interesting space. They don't have the knowledge necessarily of the COP process. I mean, so it's they have a message, but they don't know where they can put it. But it's unbelievable. In 2 years, they have a call to action. They're at COP. They're in their negotiating teams now. They're advocating for their needs and influencing the negotiating agenda. So to make sure that their needs are at the forefront. And it's and one of the things is around access to finance. I have to just reiterate that is that they are really struggling with access to finance, specifically for locally led adaptation, where again it needs to take place at the grassroots level. So it's an interesting way, but that is how an example of how you're going to see the Global South agenda being at the forefront of some of these conversations is through capacity. And then we do a lot of work with youth in the same vein, women groups, etc. So that's where the real agenda comes to the fore. And then also when you are opening up space in the decision-making process. So when you're writing a policy or developing that process, if you've got voices of people that matter in that process, then the buy-in, the ownership, the operationalization and implementation they're part of that process, which means their voices are then being heard at a global level. So it's at all different levels, different platforms, different people.
Thank you. Yes, anyone else want to compliment on this point?
I think we need more south-to-south cooperation, but also north and south. I mean, north-to-north cooperation is really easy. MOUs are written in English. People know these kind of laws. Think tanks, they have their magazines. So this is very, business as usual. And we have to, pay our Financial Times subscription, which is great. I love Financial Times. But, in order to get more voices from the Global South needs to better prepare itself by doing interesting things in its own manner. India did a very interesting G20. People were traveling to India like many times of the year, going to various parties and cultural activities in many places. India did it in its own way, and it did an amazing job. So the Global South is diverse, is super diverse. And it's not that poor and anymore in terms of, it's getting more important. So we can help each other to do like nice things. So we can call attention, for example, cities can do this thing called PPA, like Power Purchase Agreement, right? It's quite common on the Global North. On the Global South, Rio was the first one to do it. Why? Because you have to go through public proceedings of buying energy. And that is mitigation and adaptation all at once, and you save public money by being smart. So, to be smart in the Global South is different. And it's meaningful. So maybe we can be interesting to you guys. So come to our city, and see that we won't bite. We will do, a nice hosting job. But we want also to develop things, interesting initiatives, such as the Global Biofuels Alliance. It is meaningful. This kind of things matter.
Yeah, well, thank you. Passionate, again, compliment to that. Very quick, because we have some closing remarks also we need to leave time for. So very quick.
No closing remarks, just on the question of this. I think one of the things we could probably do better is have non-government voices in many of these institutions and these global, institutions which matter, because government voices are there. And he's right, Global South government is also gaining a lot of, recognition, which is very good. But diversity of voices is very important as well. And in that diversity, it needs to be, of course, business, but it needs to be everybody else as well. It's not just business. I mean, multi-stakeholder. Therefore, when we talk of alliances and collaborations like the First Movers Coalition or any other ISA or GBA, why is it should not only be the governments, it should be non-government also as a part of these alliances. Then they get to say and see and then make the policies around it and say that these can be implemented well. So if we open this up a little bit, and may not be in the negotiation part, but when we are doing collaborations and we are doing these alliances, I think it's easier to open that up.
Yeah, great. The non-state actor side of things are very important. Great. Well, wrap up straight away because I know we do have some closing remarks. So thank you for the excellent panel. I found that fascinating. I hope you did too. I won't sum it up because I'll pass straight back to Satish, who will introduce our final speaker.
Oh, thank you. We are very short on time, but we have an esteemed guest with us in the room. So Mr. Nadir Godrej from the Godrej Industries is here. It would be great to have him say a few words to the group.
Thank you. I'll talk a little bit about our journey towards sustainability. In 2010, we started a program called Good and Green, which was a corporate social responsibility program. And we had an Indian institute, DASRA, and FSG from the US design the program. They consulted all our employees, so they were all on board. And we took ambitious goals, which we haven't quite achieved. But in 2010, we decided would be carbon neutral, water neutral, and solid waste neutral by 2020. Many of our businesses are water positive. In between, in 2015, the Indian government introduced compulsory social responsibility. So we have to spend 2% of our profits on social responsibility. We already had a program, and we took the idea of Michael Porter that there could be shared value. So we decided to do that. And some of our corporate social responsibility projects, like watershed development, has community value. It helps our agribusiness. There is some carbon sequestration going on, so it helps our environmental goals. We don't believe that there should be any penalty for doing good. You need intelligent solutions that solve multiple problems at the same time. And this is not an onerous task. We just have to be smart about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Shlok, I'd like to invite you just to bring this discussion to a close. And thank everyone.
So I believe that closing remarks, or at least I like to believe that they should be like your carbon footprint, as small as possible. So I'm gonna wrap this up as quickly as I can. It's been an amazing session. Thank you, Ratish, for guiding us through today's session as ably as ever. I think we can safely agree that the resonance of India's G20 presidency and the Green Development Pact is actually quite profound and also twofold. So first, I think developing nations have actually delicately woven their climate needs into the fabric of CBDR. And so that framework has allowed us to actually embrace very nuanced solutions while also honoring socio-economic aspirations. I think that's come up quite a few times. And in doing so, hopefully resoundingly recommit to the journey of combating climate change. Helen Mountford, both Helens actually, you really sort of poignantly underscored that point, I think, earlier, when you mentioned that both the energy transition will have to have massive human development benefits attached to it. Two, there's going to be a need to sort of ensure an enabling major resilience and adaptation efforts. And third, of course, you mentioned that we need to focus on the role that philanthropy can play, and I think that can't be underscored enough. The second sort of impact, I think, is the one that will really reverberate globally, which is to amplify the visibility and acceptance of developing countries' aspirations, especially on international platforms like COP28. Your question at the end, Ratish, around how do we sort of showcase the global south, or as I like to say, emerging economies, more profoundly, I think is a really important one. I think today stands as irrefutable proof that the voices of emerging economies have a prominent and enduring space in the ongoing climate dialogue. Thank you, Mr. Godrej. You were asked last minute, but you were very gracious. So we really appreciate that. I would encourage everyone to please talk to him after the panel as well. Someone said this morning that 1 + 1 can't equal 2 anymore. It has to equal 11. And I really felt that that was a very strong message around not just the ambition for this COP, but also the colossal financial needs that we need in order to enable this transition. So on behalf of the Climate Group, Sattva, the Center on Global Energy Policy, ClimateWorks Foundation, and of course the India Climate Collaborative, I want to really express a very heartfelt gratitude to all our speakers for sharing their time and their invaluable insights. Thank you to our lovely audience. Congratulations on finding this room. I couldn't. So you've done remarkably well. And we really appreciate the We Mean Business Coalition for generously providing this space today for this dialogue. The climate challenge is undeniably formidable. It requires a massive collective effort. We need to foster inclusive energy transitions, implementing adaptation measures, and of course, delivering crucial finance. I hope that our joint presence at COP28 will serve as a resounding reminder that equity and inclusion have to be the beating heart of global climate conversations like this one, so that we can make sure that no country and no community is left behind. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely COP.